So performance reporting and measurement are two significant areas standard setters have identified as needing significant improvement. The ISB is working on both of those areas, one in their disclosure initiative for performance reporting, and in the conceptual framework relative to measurement, and basically gave up. Right? And the FASB is undertaking both those initiatives, and we don't know where that's going to go, although the FASB at this point is working on a measurement chapter of the conceptual framework. That may fail like the ISB's efforts, and is looking at, next week, deciding whether the future of the FASB agenda is going to go relative to performance reporting and 3 other key topics. During my time at the FASB, the ideas in this presentation, along with others from other people on boards, have been discussed around the world, in the United States and at several different international venues. The purpose of this presentation is not to declare that I know what the answer should be. Too often I observed at the ISB and the FASB as standard setting based at the whim of whoever was sitting at the board, and even in the conceptual framework.